Greetings, I am Christina, Akshita Veda, coming to you on behalf of the people of Assyria and the Empire of Nubia, also known as Christina Ma'at. I will be reading from the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Article 1. The American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples applies to the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Self-identification as indigenous peoples will be a fundamental criterion for determining to whom this declaration applies. States shall respect the right to such self-identification as indigenous, whether individually or collectively, in keeping with the practices and institutions of each indigenous people. Article 2. States recognize and respect the multicultural and multilingual character of indigenous peoples who are an integral part of their societies. Article 3. Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Article 4. Nothing in this declaration may be interpreted as implying for any state, people, group, or person any right to engage in any activity or to perform any act contrary to the Charter of the Organization of American States or the Charter of the United Nations, or construed as authorizing or encouraging any action which would dismember or impair, totally or in part, the territorial integrity or political unity of sovereign and independent states. Section 2, Article 5. Full effect and observance of human rights. Indigenous peoples and individuals have the right to the full enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms as recognized in the Charter of the United Nations, the Charter of the Organization of American States, and international human rights law. Article 6. Collective rights. Indigenous peoples have collective rights that are indispensable for their existence, well-being, and integral development as peoples. In that regard, states recognize and respect the right of indigenous peoples to their collective action, to their judicial, social, political, and economic systems or institutions, to their own cultures, to profess and practice their spiritual beliefs, to use their own tongues and languages, and to their lands, territories, and resources. States shall promote with full and effective participation of indigenous peoples the harmonious coexistence of the rights and systems of different population groups and cultures. Article 7. Gender equality. 1. Indigenous women have the right to the recognition, protection, and enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms provided for in international law free from discrimination of any kind. 2. States recognize that violence against indigenous peoples and individuals, particularly women, hinders or nullifies the enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms. 3. States shall adopt, in conjunction with indigenous peoples, the necessary measures to prevent and eradicate all forms of violence and discrimination, particularly against indigenous women and children. Article 8. Right to belong to indigenous peoples. Indigenous individuals and communities have the right to belong to one or more indigenous peoples, in accordance with the identity, traditions, customs, and systems of belonging of each people. No discrimination of any kind may arise from the exercise of such a right. Article 9. Juridical personality. States shall recognize fully the juridical personality of indigenous peoples, respecting indigenous forms of organization and promoting the full exercise of the rights recognized in this declaration. Article 10. Rejection of assimilation. 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain, express, and freely develop their cultural identity in all respects, free from any external attempt at assimilation. 2. States shall not carry out, adopt, support, or favor any any policy of assimilation of indigenous peoples or of destruction of their cultures. Article 11. Protection against genocide. Indigenous peoples have the right not to be the object of any form of genocide or attempts to exterminate them. Article 12. Guarantees against racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Indigenous peoples have the right not to be the object of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, or related intolerance. States shall adopt the preventive and corrective measures necessary for the full and effective protection of that right. Section 3. Cultural identity. Article 13. Right to cultural identity and integrity. 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to their own cultural identity and integrity, and to their cultural heritage, whether tangible or intangible, including historic and ancestral heritage, and to the protection, preservation, maintenance, and development of that cultural heritage for their collective continuity and that of their members, and so as to transmit that heritage to future generations. 2. States shall provide redress through effective mechanisms, which may include restitution developed in conjunction with indigenous peoples, with respect to their cultural, intellectual, religious, and spiritual property taken without their free, prior, and informed consent, or in violation of their laws, traditions, and customs. 3. Indigenous people have the right to recognition and respect for all their ways of life, cosmovisions, spirituality, uses, customs, norms, traditions, forms of social, economic, and political organization, forms of transmission of knowledge, institutions, practices, beliefs, values, dress, and languages, recognizing their interrelationship as established in this declaration. Article 14, Systems of Knowledge, Language, and Communication. 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to preserve, use, develop, revitalize, and transmit to future generations their own histories, languages, oral traditions, philosophies, systems of knowledge, writing, and literature, and to designate and retain their own names for their communities, individuals, and places. Two, states shall adopt adequate and effective measures to protect the exercise of this right with the full and effective participation of indigenous peoples. 3. Indigenous peoples have the right to promote and develop all their systems and media of communication, including their own radio and television programs, and to have equal access to all other means of communication and information. States shall take measures to promote the broadcast of radio and television programs in indigenous languages, particularly in areas with an indigenous presence. States shall support and facilitate the creation of indigenous radio and television stations, as well as other means of information and communication. 4. States, in conjunction with indigenous peoples, shall make efforts to ensure that those people can understand and be understood in their own languages in administrative, political, and judicial proceedings, if necessary, through the provision of interpretation or by other effective means. Article 15, Education. 1. Indigenous peoples and individuals, particularly indigenous children, have the right to all levels and forms of education without discrimination. 2. States and indigenous peoples, in keeping with the principle of equality of opportunity, shall promote the reduction of disparities in education between indigenous and non-indigenous peoples. 3. Indigenous peoples have the right to establish and control their educational systems and institutions, providing education in their own languages in a manner appropriate to their cultural methods of teaching and learning. 4. States, in conjunction with indigenous peoples, shall take effective measures to enable indigenous individuals living outside their communities, particularly children, to have access to education in their own languages and cultures. 5. States shall promote harmonious intercultural relations, ensuring that the curricula of state educational systems reflect the pluricultural and multilingual nature of their societies and encourage respect for and knowledge of the different indigenous cultures. States, in conjunction with indigenous peoples, shall promote intercultural education that reflects the cosmovision, histories, languages, knowledge, values, cultures, practices, and ways of life of those peoples. 6. States, in conjunction with indigenous peoples, shall adopt necessary and effective measures to ensure the exercise and observance of those rights. Article 16. Indigenous Spirituality. 1. Indigenous peoples have the right freely to exercise their own spirituality and beliefs, and by virtue of that right to practice, develop, transmit, and teach their traditions, customs, and ceremonies, and to carry them out in public and in private, whether individually or collectively. 2. No indigenous people or individual shall be subjected to pressures or impositions or any other type of coercive measures that might impair or limit their right freely to exercise their indigenous spirituality and beliefs. 3. Indigenous peoples have the right to preserve, protect, and access their sacred sites, including their burial grounds, to use and control their sacred objects and relics, and to recover their human remains. 4. States, in conjunction with indigenous peoples, shall adopt effective measures to promote respect for indigenous spirituality and beliefs, and to protect the integrity of the symbols, practices, ceremonies, expressions, and spiritual protocols of indigenous peoples in accordance with international law. Article 17. Indigenous families. The family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society. Indigenous peoples have the right to preserve, maintain, and promote their own family systems. States shall recognize, respect, and protect the various indigenous forms of family, in particular the extended family, as well as their forms of matrimonial union, filiation, descent, and family name. In all cases, gender and generational equity shall be recognized and respected. 2. In matters relating to custody, adoption, severance of family ties, and related matters, the best interest of the child shall be a primary consideration in determining the best interest of the child. Courts and other relevant institutions shall take into account the right of every indigenous child in community with members of his or her people to enjoy his or her own culture, to profess and practice his or her own religion, and to use his or her own language, and in that regard shall take into account that indigenous law of the people concerned and their points of view, rights, and interests, including the positions of the individuals, the family, and the community. Article 18, Health. 1. Indigenous peoples have the collective and individual right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical, mental, and spiritual health. 2. Indigenous peoples have the right to their own health systems and practices, as well as to the use and protection of their vital medicinal plants, animals, and minerals, and other natural resources for medicinal use in their ancestral lands and territories. 3. States shall take measures to prevent and prohibit indigenous peoples and individuals from being subjects of research programs, biological or medical experimentation, or sterilization without their free, prior, and informed consent. Likewise, indigenous peoples and individuals have the right, as appropriate, to access their data, medical records, and documentation of research conducted by individuals and institutions, whether public or private. 4. Indigenous peoples have the right to use, without discrimination of any kind, all the health and medical care institutions and services accessible to the general population. States, in consultation and coordination with indigenous peoples, shall promote intercultural systems and practices in the medical and health services provided in indigenous communities, including training of indigenous technical and professional healthcare personnel. 5. States shall ensure the effective exercise of the rights contained in this article. Article 19. Right to protection of a healthy environment. 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to live in harmony with nature and to a healthy, safe, and sustainable environment, essential conditions for the full enjoyment of the rights to life and to their spirituality, cosmovision, and collective well-being. 2. Indigenous peoples have the right to conserve, restore, and protect the environment, and to manage their lands, territories, and resources in a sustainable way. 3. Indigenous peoples have the right to be protected against the introduction, abandonment, dispersion, transit, indiscriminate use, or deposit of any harmful substance that could adversely affect indigenous communities, lands, territories, and resources. 4. Indigenous peoples have the right to the conservation and protection of the environment and the productive capacity of their lands and territories and resources. States shall establish and implement assistance programs for indigenous peoples for such conservation and protection without discrimination. Section 4. Organizational and political rights. Article 20. Rights of association, assembly, and freedom of expression and thought. 1. Indigenous peoples have the rights of association, assembly, organization, and expression, and are entitled to exercise them without interference and in accordance, inter alia, with their cosmovision, values, uses, customs, ancestral traditions, beliefs, spirituality, and other cultural practices. 2. Indigenous peoples have the right to assemble on their sacred and ceremonial sites and areas. For that purpose, they shall have free access to and use of such sites and areas. 3. Indigenous peoples, in particular those who are divided by international borders, have the right to travel and to maintain and develop contracts, relations, and direct cooperation, including activities for spiritual, cultural, political, economic, and social purposes with their members and other peoples. 4. States, in consultation and cooperation with indigenous peoples, shall adopt effective measures to ensure the exercise and enforcement of these rights. Article 21, Right to Autonomy or Self-Government. 1. Indigenous peoples, in exercising their right to self-determination, have the right to autonomy or self-government in matters relating to their internal and local affairs, as well as ways and means for financing their autonomous functions. 2. Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and develop their own decision-making institutions. They also have the right to participate in decision-making in matters which would affect their rights. They may do so directly or through their representatives, and in accordance with their own norms, procedures, and traditions. They also have the right to equal opportunities in assessing and participating fully and effectively as peoples in all national institutions and forums, including deliberative bodies. Article 22, Indigenous Law and Jurisdiction. 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to promote, develop, and maintain their institutional structures and their distinctive customs, spirituality, traditions, procedures, practices, and in the cases where they exist, juridical systems or customs in accordance with international human rights standards. 2. Indigenous law and legal systems shall be recognized and respected by national, regional, and international legal systems. 3. Matters concerning indigenous individuals or their rights or interests in the jurisdiction of each state shall be conducted in such a way as to afford indigenous individuals the right to full representation with dignity and equality before the law. Consequently, they are entitled without discrimination to equal protection and benefit of the law, including the use of linguistic and cultural interpreters. 4. States shall take effective measures in conjunction with indigenous peoples to ensure the implementation of this article. Article 23. Participation of indigenous peoples and contributions of indigenous legal and organizational systems. 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to full and effective participation in decision-making through representatives chosen by themselves in accordance with their own institutions in matters which affect their rights and which are related to the development and execution of laws, public policies, programs, plans, and actions related to indigenous matters. 2. States shall consult and cooperate in good faith with the indigenous peoples concerned through their own representative institutions in order to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent before adopting and implementing legislative or administrative measures that may affect them. Article 24. Treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements. 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to the recognition, observance, and enforcement of treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements concluded with states or their successors in accordance with their true spirit and intent in good faith, and to have states honor and respect same. States shall give due consideration to the understanding of the indigenous peoples as regards to treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements. 2. When disputes in relations to such treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements cannot be resolved between the parties, they shall be submitted to competent bodies, including regional and international bodies, by the states or indigenous peoples concerned. 3. Nothing in this declaration may be interpreted as diminishing or eliminating the rights of indigenous peoples contained in treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements. Section 5. Social, economic, and property rights. Article 25. Traditional forms of property and cultural survival, right to land, territory, and resources. 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinctive spiritual, cultural, and material relationship with their lands, territories, and resources, and to uphold their responsibilities to preserve them for themselves and for future generations. 2. Indigenous peoples have the right to the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used or acquired. 3. Indigenous peoples have the right to own, use, develop, and control the lands, territories, and resources that they possess by reason of traditional ownership or other traditional occupation or use, as well as those which they have otherwise acquired. 4. States shall give legal recognition and protection to these lands, territories, and resources. Such recognition shall be conducted with due respect to the customs, traditions, and land tenure systems of the indigenous peoples concerned. 5. Indigenous peoples have the right to legal recognition of the various and particular modalities and forms of property, possessions, and ownership of their lands, territories, and resources in accordance with legal In accordance with the legal system of each state and the relevant international instruments, states shall establish special regimens appropriate for such recognition and for their effective demarcation or titling. Article 26. Indigenous Peoples, Involuntary Isolation or Initial Contact. 1. Indigenous peoples, involuntary isolation or initial contact have the right to remain in that condition and to live freely and in accordance with their cultures. 2. States shall, with the knowledge and participation of indigenous peoples and organizations, adopt appropriate policies and measures to recognize, respect, and protect the lands, territories, environment, and cultures of these peoples, as well as their life and individual and collective integrity. Article 27. Labor rights. 1. Indigenous peoples and individuals have the rights and guarantees recognized in national and international labor law. States shall take all special measures necessary to prevent, punish, and remedy any discrimination against indigenous peoples and individuals. 2. States, in conjunction with indigenous peoples, shall adopt immediate and effective measures to eliminate exploitative labor practices with regard to indigenous peoples, in particular indigenous children, women, and elderly persons. 3. Where indigenous peoples are not effectively protected by the law applicable to workers in general, states, in conjunction with indigenous people, shall adopt all necessary measures to A. Protect indigenous workers and employees in relation to hiring under fair and equal conditions in both formal and informal employment. B. Establish, apply, or improve labor inspection and the enforcement of rules with particular attention to inter alia, regions, companies, and labor activities in which indigenous workers or employees participate. C. Establish, apply, or enforce laws so that both female and male indigenous workers, one, enjoy equal opportunities and treatment in all terms, conditions, and benefits of employment, including training and capacity building under national and international law. 2. Enjoy the right of association, the right to form trade unions and participate in trade unions activities, and the right to collective bargaining with employers through representatives of their own choosing or through workers' organizations, including traditional authorities. 3. Are not subject to discrimination or harassment on the basis of inter alia, race, sex, origin, or indigenous identity. 4. Are not subject to coercive hiring systems, including debt servitude or any other form of forced or compulsory labor, regardless of whether the labor arrangement arises from law, custom, or an individual or collective arrangement, in which case the labor arrangement shall be deemed absolutely null and void. 5. Are not forced to work in conditions that endanger their health and personal safety and are protected from work that does not conform to occupational health and safety standards. 6. Receive full and effective legal protection without discrimination when they provide their services as seasonal, occasional, or migrant workers, as well as when they are hired by employers such that they receive the benefits of national laws and practices, which shall be in accordance with international human rights laws and standards for this category of workers. D. Ensure that indigenous workers and their employers are informed of the rights of indigenous workers under national law and international and indigenous standards, and of the remedies and actions available to them to protect those rights. 4. States shall take measures to promote employment of indigenous individuals. Article 28. Protection of cultural, heritage, and intellectual property. 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to full recognition and respect for the ownership, dominion, possession, control, development, and protection of their tangible and intangible cultural heritage and intellectual property, including its collective nature transmitted over millennia from generation to generation. 2. The collective intellectual property of indigenous peoples, including inter alia, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions, including traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources, ancestral designs and procedures, cultural, artistic, spiritual, technological, and scientific expressions, tangible and intangible cultural heritage, as well as knowledge and developments of their own related to biodiversity and the utility and qualities of seeds, medicinal plants, flora, and fauna. 3. States, with the full and effective participation of indigenous peoples, shall adopt measures necessary to ensure that national and international agreements and regimes provide recognition and adequate protection for the cultural heritage of indigenous peoples and intellectual property associated with that heritage. In adopting such measures, consultations shall be held to obtain the free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples. Article 29. Right to development. 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and determine their own priorities with respect to their political, economic, social, and cultural development in conformity with their own cosmovision. They also have the right to be guaranteed the enjoyment of their own means of subsistence and development, and to engage freely in all their economic activities. 2. The right includes the development of policies, plans, programs, and strategies in the exercise of their right to development and to implement them in accordance with their political and social organization, norms and procedures, own cosmovisions, and institutions. 3. Indigenous peoples have the right to be actively involved in developing and determining development programs that affect them and, to the extent possible, to administer such programs through their own institutions. 4. States shall consult and cooperate in good faith with the indigenous peoples concerned through their own representative institutions in order to obtain their free and informed consent prior to the approval of any project affecting their lands or territories and other resources, particularly in connection with the development, utilization, or exploitation of mineral, water, and other resources. 5. Indigenous peoples have the right to effective measures to migrate adverse ecological, economic, social, cultural, or spiritual impacts of the implementation of development projects that affect their rights. Indigenous peoples who have been deprived of their means of subsistence and development have the right to restitution, and where this is not possible, to fair and equitable compensation. This includes the right to compensation for any harm caused to them by the implementation of plans, programs, or projects of the state, international financial institutions, or private business. Article 30. Right to peace, security, and protection. 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to peace and security. 2. Indigenous peoples have the right to recognition and respect for their institutions for the maintenance of their organization and control of their communities and peoples. 3. Indigenous peoples have the right to protection and security in situations or periods of internal or international armed conflict in accordance with international humanitarian law. 4. States, in compliance with international agreements to which they are party, in particular those of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, including the Geneva Convention relative to the protection of civilian persons in time of war and Protocol 2 thereof relating to the protection of victims of non-international armed conflict, shall, in the event of armed conflicts, take adequate measures to protect the rights, institutions, lands, territories, and resources of indigenous peoples and their communities. Likewise, states, A, shall not recruit indigenous children and adolescents into the armed forces under any circumstance. B, shall adopt effective reparation measures and provide adequate resources for said reparation in conjunction with the indigenous peoples concerned for the damages or harm caused by an armed conflict. C, shall take special and effective measures in collaboration with indigenous peoples to guarantee that indigenous women and children live free from all forms of violence, especially sexual violence, and shall guarantee the right of access to justice, protection, and effective reparation for harm caused to the victims. 5. Military activities shall not take place in the lands or territories of Indigenous peoples, unless justified by a relevant public interest or otherwise freely agreed to or requested by the Indigenous peoples concerned. Section 6, General Provisions, Article 31. States shall ensure the full enjoyment of civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights by Indigenous peoples. Their right to maintain their cultural and spiritual identity, religious traditions, cosmovisions, and values, the protection of their sacred sites, places of worship, and all the human rights contained in this declaration. 2. States shall promote with full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples the adoption of such legislative and other measures as may be necessary to give effect to the rights recognized in this declaration. Article 32. All the rights and freedoms recognized in the present declaration are guaranteed equally to Indigenous women and men. Article 33. Indigenous peoples and individuals have the right to effective and suitable remedies, including prompt judicial remedies for the reparations of any violation of their collective and individual rights. States with the full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples shall provide the necessary mechanisms for the exercise of this right. Article 34. In the event of conflicts or disputes with Indigenous peoples, states shall provide, with the full and effective participation of those peoples, just, equitable, and effective mechanisms and procedures for their prompt resolution. For that purpose, due consideration and recognition shall be accorded to the customs, traditions, norms, and legal systems of the Indigenous peoples concerned. Article 35. Nothing in this declaration may be interpreted as limiting, restricting, or denying human rights in any way or as authorizing any action that is not in keeping with international human rights law. Article 36. In the exercise of the rights of enunciation in the present declaration, the human rights and fundamental freedoms of all shall be respected. The exercise of the right set forth in this declaration shall be subject only to such limitations as are determined by law and in accordance with international human rights obligations. Any such limitations shall be non-discriminatory and strictly as required for the purpose of securing due recognition and respect for the rights and freedoms of others and for meeting the just and most compelling needs of a democratic society. The provisions set forth in this declaration shall be interpreted in accordance with the principles of justice, democracy, respect for human rights, equality, non-discrimination, good governance, and good faith. Article 37. Indigenous peoples have the right to have access to financial and technical assistance from states as through international cooperation for the enjoyment of the rights contained in this declaration. Article 38. The Organization of American States, its organs, agencies, and entities shall adopt all necessary measures to promote the full observance, protection, and application of the provisions contained in this declaration, and shall endeavor to ensure their efficacy. Article 39. The nature and scope of the measures that shall be adopted to implement this declaration shall be determined in accordance with the spirit and purpose of said declaration. Article 40. Nothing in this declaration shall be construed as diminishing or extinguishing rights that indigenous peoples now have and may acquire in the future. Article 41. The rights recognized in this declaration and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples constitute the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of the indigenous peoples of America. Indigenous peoples of the Americas. That concludes the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, 41 articles. Thank you for listening.